Hello and welcome to the February edition of Third Thursday at Hoover's. I see many of you have been with us before and we're so grateful for your continued support during the last year. I'm Brad Reiners, the Communications Director at the Hoover Presidential Foundation. We're so glad you could all join us this evening. I'd like to encourage you to regularly check our website and Facebook page, as well as those of the library, historic site, and your favorite public library, for special program offerings that will pop up in the months ahead. In fact, we have online programs every month for you to enjoy, including some special programs hosted by members of the Hoover family. Watch your emails for details about those programs. I also want to tell you about two other programs that are coming up in the next few weeks. First, we're accepting nominations for the Uncommon Public Service Award among state legislatures. The Uncommon Public Service Award was created to honor those public servants who demonstrate uncommon service to the people of Iowa above and beyond their legislative responsibilities. Just visit our website under the Grants and Awards tab to enter your nominations for a state representative, a state senator, or both. The deadline is March 1st. The other program is especially exciting because we will deliver over $60,000 in scholarship funding to 15 Iowa high school juniors who create and run a community service-oriented project of their own design. The 15 finalists will each earn $1,500, and 4 of those will earn an additional $10,000 scholarship each. It's called the Uncommon Student Awards, and it's only for Iowa high school juniors who apply by March 15th. You can also find the details under the Grants and Award tab on our website, or visit uncommonstudent.org for more details. I hope you'll tell everyone you know about these two great programs. As for tonight's program, we invite you to enter questions at any time during the program through the Q&A feature you'll find along the edge of your screen. You may also vote for questions someone else has entered if you'd like to hear those questions answered. As we might not have time to answer all the questions provided, the top vote getters will be asked first. Now, today's presentation is called Lincoln, Race, and the Challenge of Self-Government. This presentation will examine Lincoln's statesmanship in the context of longstanding and widespread racial bigotry against Black Americans. It will explore how Lincoln attempted to inform public opinion regarding the natural rights of Black Americans by reclaiming the central idea of the American regime, namely human equality. Our speaker is Dr. Lucas Morel. He is the John K. Boardman Jr. Professor of Politics and head of the Politics Department at Washington and Lee University. Professor Morel is the author or editor of the following books: Lincoln's Sacred Effort, Defining Religion's Role in American Self-Government, Lincoln and Liberty, Wisdom for the Ages, Ralph Ellison and the Raft of Hope, A Political Companion to Invisible Man, and The New Territory, Ralph Ellison and the 21st Century. His most recent book is Lincoln and the American Founding, published in the Concise Lincoln Library series of Southern Illinois University Press. Professor Morel is a trustee of the Supreme Court Historical Society, a former president of the Abraham Lincoln Institute, a consultant on the Library of Congress exhibits on Lincoln and the Civil War, was a member of the Scholarly Board of Advisors for the Abraham Lincoln Bicentennial Commission, and currently serves as the U.S. Semi-Quincentennial Commission, which will plan activities to commemorate the founding of the United States of America. Professor, it's a pleasure having you here tonight.
Thank you, Mr. Reiners. Thank you, Tom Schwartz, who was our original contact on this, and the folks at the Hoover Foundation and Library for inviting me to speak in your Third Thursdays series. The subject of Lincoln and race has been in the news of late, and I hope my remarks today will provide both content and context for understanding how he navigated that long-standing problem in America. In the 1850s, when he really began to make a serious mark politically, Lincoln had no choice but to address the impact that race, or rather racial prejudice, had on American politics for far too long, but one that he saw that was not going to go away anytime soon. What I'm calling the challenge of self-government refers to an abiding feature of self-governing societies, namely how a free people secure justice must come by their consent, which will always be subject not only to their reason, but also their self-interest, their passion, and their prejudice, unfortunately. Lincoln didn't, in other words, have the luxury of appealing to citizens who had no racial bias whatsoever, especially towards racial minorities. So given this unfortunate reality in America, pervasive racial prejudice, the question is less, was Lincoln a racist? But more, did Lincoln say or do anything to move the needle on the white supremacy that dominated the politics of Illinois and the nation of his day? I say move the needle because in the real world, it is incredibly difficult for people to change their way of thinking, let alone their way of acting. So the best we can ask for is progress, not perfection, at least not immediately in this respect. Furthermore, that racial bigotry also existed not only in the country at large, but it complicated how the majority white population was going to resolve its growing sectionalism over the future of slavery in the country. Any serious examination of Lincoln's leadership on the race question must consider this social and political context. In American politics, the fundamental context of what Lincoln called the sheet anchor of American republicanism, that was consent, the consent of the governed. He said, in this and like communities, public sentiment is everything. With public sentiment, nothing can fail. Without it, nothing can succeed. Consequently, he who molds public sentiment goes deeper than he who enacts statutes or pronounces decisions. He makes statutes and decisions possible or impossible to be executed. So with this, the consent of the people as the ultimate driver of public policy, then the measure of anything Lincoln said or did must be taken in light of his attitude or approach towards public opinion. What is he doing with regards to the public opinion that already existed at that time? Now, my argument is simple. I think Lincoln's statesmanship is demonstrated in how he at least attempted to elevate the public mind regarding the status of Black people on American soil within the context of him achieving certain distinct policy objectives. Statesmanship in a republic requires shaping public opinion so that government can secure the greatest amount of justice that the public will support. The best way to appreciate Lincoln's efforts as what I consider to be the most prudent efforts, given the social reality of racial bigotry, even in a free state like Illinois, is by contrasting him with his longstanding rival and a much more accomplished politician in the 1850s, and that was Illinois Senator Stephen A. Douglas. Douglas was the leading Democrat and therefore the leading politician of the 1850s. There was a stark difference between Douglas, who reinforced the racial prejudice of Illinoisans and along with them, the nation, and Lincoln, who tried to build a bridge, I will argue, from where Illinoisans stood vis-a-vis Black people and where he thought their government's ideals, the nation's ideals, required them to go. As a bedrock principle of government, self-government, the consent of the governed is the ultimate driver. The measure of his leadership, I think, can be taken by where he was trying to take the existing racial prejudice of white Illinoisans at that time, where he wanted them to go. And he believed, and I think this is what makes one of the things that makes Lincoln so distinctive in the 1850s, is that he believed that shaping public opinion among white Northerners was more urgent than trying to change the minds of slave-owning Southerners. So in particular, Lincoln thought that Stephen Douglas posed the greatest threat to the ultimate demise of slavery because of what Lincoln called his insidious doctrine of popular sovereignty. For slavery to become legal in all the states would not require Northern acceptance of what the South had considered by that time the positive good of slavery. Instead, do what Douglas was doing, which was simply inviting white Northerners to accept, or shall we say, not care or acquiesce in the expansion of racial slavery into the federal territories. Let local white settlers decide if they would permit the enslavement of Black people. That was Douglas's policy, without any interference from Congress. And it would soon, in Lincoln's mind, become legal throughout the nation. Now, unlike Stephen Douglas, who was an outspoken white supremacist, Lincoln argued that the principles of the Declaration of Independence should inform the constitutional practice of the nation, what Congress does have the authority to do. And these principles, Lincoln believed, applied to all people, regardless of race. So how does this help us make sense of the troubling things Lincoln did say about Black people, his reticence to promote civil and political equality of Blacks in Illinois, policies like Black colonization, and what some would consider the apparent slowness of President Lincoln to emancipate slaves during the war? Well, Lincoln thought that the most urgent political task was to reclaim an interpretation of the Declaration of Independence as a statement of universal principles. If that reading of the formative charter of American liberties was becoming shaky in the free states, what good would be the effort to push, for example, in Illinois, voting for Black people, a state that in 1853 passed a law banning the immigration of Blacks into the state? That was the social political condition of the time. That's Lincoln's world. And I'm not saying that he was a mere product of his environment, far from it. There were significant ways that Lincoln thought and acted differently from his neighbors to adopt this hypothesis, the hypothesis that Lincoln simply was a reflection of his environment, without further examination. And that's what I'm intending my remarks to do tonight. What I'm arguing is that what appears controversial in his politics has more to do with his realistic on-the-ground efforts to get things done in a manner that moved folks in the right direction, precisely on questions of race and what he hoped would be the eventual abolition of slavery. To do so, he tried to get them thinking about the true ground of their rights, even as white people, and what might jeopardize them if they thought otherwise. This was how he viewed Douglas's politics, and why Douglas, not Southern fire eaters positing the goodness of slavery for master and slave alike, he thought that it was Douglas's politics that posed the greatest hindrance to putting slavery, as he put it, in the course of ultimate extinction. Now, there are critics today who argue that Lincoln does not deserve his reputation as the great emancipator. For one reason, they would argue that he didn't do enough to oppose slavery before that. And what he did do was tardy, according to them. Now, first, I disagree with this downplaying of Lincoln as the great emancipator. For example, I find it puzzling that there's still a debate. It's 2021, and there's still a debate over whether Lincoln freed the slaves or did the slaves free themselves. I believe this was answered the moment he issued what is known today as his preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. Now, he issued that September 22nd, 1862. And in doing so, he announced that 100 days from then, January 1st, those enslaved in rebel-held territory in the states in the South would be free. Now, that proclamation explained that the president would, quote, recognize and maintain the freedom of such persons, end quote, and the government would not prevent, quote, any efforts they may make for their actual freedom, end quote. Notice that. The government recognizing and maintaining freedom on the one hand, and the efforts that the enslaved are making on their own. In short, the debate over whether Lincoln freed the slaves or the slaves freed themselves is resolved by Lincoln himself, who said the answer is both. This is important because the self-emancipation thesis forgets that an escaped slave may have physically left his legal master, but in the eyes of the law, he is a fugitive and therefore not secure in his freedom. This is why the last station of the Underground Railroad was not any northern free state for most of them, but Canada. They had to flee the country so that they would not be considered outlaws on American soil. An escaped slave, therefore, did not in fact free himself because he could not enjoy his freedom unless the law protected him like any other free citizen. This is why Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation was required and emphatically was not a dead letter. Until Congress repealed the Fugitive Slave Act, which they did a year later in 1864, an escaped slave, as I put it already, was an outlaw. And if caught, he could be returned to bondage. When Lincoln freed slaves in rebel-held states, it was the first time in American history that the federal government invited the enslaved to flee their legal masters and receive the protection offered by the United States government rather than be returned. Lincoln called his proclamation the central act of my administration. And he also lobbied hard to get Congress to pass the 13th Amendment before the war was over, right? Emancipation frees slaves. The 13th Amendment abolishes the actual institution. Now, if that's not doing enough to oppose slavery, I'd like to know what would be. Now, as for the supposed tardiness of the Emancipation Proclamation, that owed to a combination of factors. I'll try to keep this brief. He wasn't sure as president that he could actually liberate slaves during a time of war. So the question of its constitutionality was something that he had to sort through. The author of the notorious Dred Scott case, Chief Justice Roger Taney, he was still the chief of the United States. He was still the United States Supreme Court. Lincoln thought definitely we should pursue other avenues that would be immune or protected from legal challenge. And that principally meant the states themselves abolishing the institution. That would not be subject to constitutional challenge. But when he proposed that to the so-called border slave states, those 4 states that stayed loyal to the Union during the Civil War, none of them took him up on it. Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware, they all threw it back in his face. Lincoln was also concerned about keeping those so-called border slave states on the Union side and therefore supporting the Union war effort, which was his principal objective, preserving the Union. As he put it, to lose Kentucky, not to mention Missouri, Delaware, and Maryland, would make preserving the Union more difficult. He could not make a war to preserve the Union look like a war, at least not at the outset, as a war to abolish slavery. The former aim was uncontroversial, at least among Northern citizens, loyal citizens, whereas an abolition war was not why most white Northerners were fighting. And that was a consideration for Lincoln. He also didn't want to take an unprecedented action unless it was what he called a matter of military necessity. There are other issues, but ultimately he justified emancipation by decree, presidential decree, as a fit and necessary war measure. He appealed to his oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States, to exercise what we call today the war powers of the president. Even though war powers doesn't appear in the Constitution, that's what we consider his role as commander-in-chief. So in the end, to justify emancipation under the Constitution, he had to turn a humanitarian end, freedom, into a constitutional means. This way, emancipation would be a just act, not simply a moral one, but a just one under the Constitution. That is, it would be a legitimate expression of the supreme law of the land, which is the fundamental expression of the consent of the American people. Now, to get more closely at this question of Lincoln's alleged racism, I think the best way to answer this question, as I mentioned earlier, is to consider the context for the context of his public statements and actions as a politician or even as an aspiring politician. The most important element of that context is a human being, and that was the incumbent Senator Stephen Douglas. What Lincoln said and the policies he pursued or avoided had everything to do with what the consent of the governed was willing to support. And in the 1850s, beginning with the successful passage of the compromise measures of 1850, Stephen Douglas, who got those measures into law when Clay failed to do so, Douglas was growing in influence among Americans on both sides of the Mason-Dixon line. By the time 1859 rolls around, he was the odds-on favorite not only to be named the Democratic nominee for president, but to actually achieve the office. But his debates with Lincoln during their campaign for the Senate in 1858, this spoiled Douglas's chances among Southern voters and eventually split the Democratic Party the following year. That paved the way for Lincoln's nomination and eventual election as the nation's first Republican president. Now, what does all this have to do with Lincoln and racism? I believe that his debates with Douglas, yes, they produced some of his most controversial statements regarding the status of Blacks in America. But Lincoln knew that in Illinois, albeit a free state, it did not care in general for Black people. There was only about 5,100 Blacks who lived in that decade in Illinois, less than 1% of the population. And their rights, therefore, were determined precisely by that massive supermajority of white people. To say that Blacks were second-class citizens would be an understatement. They could not vote. They could not serve in the militia. They couldn't serve on juries where a white person was a defendant. And as mentioned already, in 1853, they actually banned in law the immigration of Blacks into their very state. So Lincoln was aware of this racial bigotry. And so he had to tread lightly when it came to promoting progress in civil or political rights for Black Illinoisans. It simply was not a front burner issue for Lincoln in the 1840s and 50s because he thought there were other fish, more important fish to fry, if you will. So more important, especially when the 1850s rolled around, was addressing politically the growing sectionalism of the country over the future of slavery in America. Specifically, would Illinoisans and citizens across the nation permit slavery to enter the federal territories? Would they prevent it from doing so? Or would they, as Douglas was tempting them to do, remain neutral and leave it to local white settlers to decide if they wanted to enslave Black people or not? Now, that's what Stephen Douglas called popular sovereignty. Now, it appeared indifferent or neutral on the slavery question because Douglas neither endorsed nor rejected the enslavement of Blacks in the federal territories. Now, in 1859, Lincoln called attention to this bowdlerized notion of popular sovereignty, and he characterized Douglas's rhetoric as a, quote, gradual and steady debauching of public opinion. By allowing white people the option of enslaving Black people, popular sovereignty implied, quote, that there is no right principle of action except self-interest, end quote. When Douglas's Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 passed, it opened up the territory north of the 3630 parallel to the spread of slavery if local white settlers voted for it, and Lincoln argued that Congress should not allow that to happen. As he read the Declaration of Independence, he argued that there can be no moral right in connection with one man's making a slave of another. And he added, no man is good enough to govern another man without that man's consent. I say this is the leading principle, the sheet anchor of American republicanism. Douglas's definition of popular sovereignty, in contrast with Lincoln's, corrupted the true principle, the bedrock principle of consent, which Lincoln believed was based on universal human equality. A year after the Kansas-Nebraska Act, Lincoln wrote to a Kentucky judge named George Robertson, and he lamented the fact of what he considered the waning, the erosion of the spirit of '76. Here's Lincoln. On the question of liberty as a principle, we are not what we have been. This is Lincoln writing in 1855, comparing his generation to the founding generation. When we were the political slaves of King George and wanted to be free, we called the maxim that all men are created equal a self-evident truth. But now that we have grown fat and have lost all dread of being slaves ourselves, we have become so greedy to be masters that we call the same maxim a self-evident lie. So here Lincoln alludes to what is the greatest political irony in American history, that we were never so enamored with liberty than when we were surrounded by slaves. Recall the famous jibe of Samuel Johnson when considering the plight, the situation of American colonists. How is it that we hear the greatest yelps for liberty among the drivers of Negroes, slave drivers. Indeed, Thomas Jefferson's declaration of the self-evident truth that all men are created equal surely sounded strange coming from the mouth of the owner of over 100 slaves. That said, the greater puzzle, I think, was not why a free society would permit slavery, but why a whole generation of American slaveholders, white slaveholders like Jefferson, would declare that human equality was the natural and therefore only legitimate basis of human rights and civil government, what Jefferson actually called sacred rights in one of the drafts of the Declaration of Independence. So simply put, the founding generation of Americans believed that they could not free themselves and free their slaves at the same time. And so they thought that to secure their own independence from England and therefore establish the institutions of civil government so that in time, the consent of the governed would secure the rights of all the governed. After the Dred Scott decision of 1857 ruled that Black Americans were not intended to be citizens of the United States, Lincoln emphatically disagreed, and he countered by explaining what the founders were trying to accomplish with the Declaration and in general their American Revolution. This is Lincoln. They did not mean to assert the obvious untruth that all were then actually enjoying that equality, nor yet that they were about to confer it immediately upon them. In fact, they had no power to confer such a boon. They meant simply to declare the right so that the enforcement of it might follow as fast as circumstances should permit. They meant to set up a standard maxim for free society, which should be familiar to all and revered by all, constantly looked to, constantly labored for, and even though never perfectly attained, constantly approximated, and thereby constantly spreading and deepening its influence, augmenting the happiness and value of life to all people of all colors everywhere. What troubled Lincoln was the diminishing influence of those principles, the principles of the Revolution, the spirit of '76 on his own generation. So Lincoln saw something more important enough to maintain at the price of leaving slavery alone, where it already existed on American soil. And that more important thing was the union of the states and the self-government that union established. This also meant that he was willing to support or at least acquiesce in second-class citizenship for Blacks in Illinois. Though in 1855, he wrote to his former roommate, Joshua Speed, that, quote, "I bite my lip and keep quiet," end quote, about the oppression suffered by American slaves. Lincoln said to Speed, "You ought rather to appreciate how much the great body of the Northern people do crucify their feelings when it came to the continuance of slavery in the United States." All this was done, Lincoln said, in order to maintain their loyalty to the Constitution and the Union. And that Constitution, that Union was a federal one. And therefore, citizens of free states didn't have authority to tell citizens of the slave states what to do about their domestic institution, like slavery. To lose what Lincoln would later call the last best hope of earth in an attempt to free American slaves would make a mockery of the quest of abolition, in fact. What good is freedom without laws and courts to protect it? This is why Lincoln, as much as he hated slavery, never called himself an abolitionist. Prior to the Civil War, most Americans viewed abolitionists as extremists, almost anarchists in their methods and subversive of the rule of law. The most famous abolitionist, William Lloyd Garrison, editor of The Liberator, he proclaimed no union with slaveholders. He burned a copy of the Constitution in public to protest its compromises with slavery, and he decried the Constitution as a covenant with death and an agreement with hell. You always knew where you stood with Garrison. Lincoln was too much of a Henry Clay Whig, strongly devoted to the rule of law and the constitutional union of the states, to fall in with that kind of a crowd, with that intemperate rhetoric. And this explains why Stephen Douglas, in fact, repeatedly called Lincoln an abolitionist in all 7 of their debates. Lincoln must have been saying something that gave Douglas ammunition for that charge. You're an abolitionist. Lincoln's supposed abolition bona fides were even trumpeted far beyond the Illinois border. For example, on the day of the debate at Quincy, the governor of Virginia publicly endorsed Stephen Douglas, while the Houston Telegraph lambasted Lincoln as, quote, a rank, rampant, poison-mouthed, tearing, raving, and raging abolitionist. The other mainstay of Douglas's criticisms of his Republican rival was that Lincoln was, according to Douglas, a promoter of complete racial equality. It is this claim that will give Lincoln tremendous difficulty in persuading old-line Whigs in Illinois to vote for him, as they had no sympathy for Blacks then living in Illinois or anywhere else for that matter. White supremacy was not the exception, but the rule in Illinois, in the free state of Illinois. Now, this social context would shape how both Lincoln and Douglas appealed to the Illinois citizenry. Again, even though it was a free state, and it had some abolitionist communities in the northernmost part, Illinois permitted few civil rights and no political rights for the few Blacks that resided in their state, in that state. The 1848 Constitution of Illinois allowed only white males to vote and serve in the militia. And as I mentioned earlier, Illinois statutes barred Blacks from serving on juries and from offering testimony against whites in the courts. So the level of anti-Black prejudice in Illinois could also be measured by that ban on Blacks entering the state. Douglas exploited that pervasive racial bigotry, routinely calling the Republican Party the Black Republican Party, or he called it the Abolition Party. It was a charge Lincoln had to respond to in a way that did not undermine his devotion to the principles of the Declaration of Independence. So Douglas's corruption of the Declaration of Independence consent principle manifested itself on this racial question in those debates as follows. Douglas claimed, quote, "This government was made by our fathers on the white basis," end quote. Here, this is language foreshadowing that of segregationist Governor George Wallace over a century later. Remember, I say segregation now, segregation today, segregation tomorrow. Douglas declared that the United States, quote, "was made for white men, by white men, for the benefit of white men, for and their posterity forever, was intended to be administered by white men in all time to come." His popular sovereignty denied the right of consent to Black people. Douglas considered them and all other non-white races an inferior race. To argue otherwise, Douglas thought, especially in interpreting the Declaration otherwise, Douglas said was a monstrous heresy. Douglas hastened to add that whites should not abuse their authority over Blacks, but regulate their conduct consistent with the welfare of the local community. As he put it, humanity and Christianity both require that the Negro shall have and enjoy every right, privilege, and every immunity consistent with the safety of the society in which he lives. We know what that's a euphemism for. But Douglas reiterated that the rights that Blacks should have protected was a question which each state and each territory must decide for itself. In other words, not Congress. Douglas answered for Illinois, "We have provided that the Negro shall not be a slave, but we've also provided that he shall not be a citizen. Protect him in his civil rights, life, person, property, only depriving him of all political rights whatsoever, and refusing to put him on an equality with the white man." That's how explicit Douglas's white supremacy was. So, not natural rights possessed by all human beings, antecedent to the establishment of government, but mere legal positivism, practiced by white people, majority of the population. This would determine what so-called inferior races would enjoy under state and territorial governments. For his part, Lincoln tried to show white Illinoisans that they would be undermining their own right to be ruled by consent if they allowed white settlers outside of their state, in a territory like Kansas or Nebraska, to enslave Black people. The exercise of majority political might against the Black minority in Illinois defied the noblest ideals of America, and he believed would prove down the road to be a double-edged sword. Here's Lincoln. When you have stricken down the principles of the Declaration and thereby consigned the Negro to hopeless and eternal bondage, are you quite sure that the demon will not turn and rend you? Lincoln thought that the bulwark of our liberty and independence was not arms or soldiers, but an idea, a timeless universal truth he found in the Declaration. As he put it, our reliance is in the love of liberty which God has planted in our bosoms. Our defense is in the preservation of the spirit which prizes liberty as the heritage of all men in all lands everywhere. The key to the protection of the rights of whites in America, Lincoln believed, depended on their conviction that it belonged to all human beings. Humanity, not race, was the basis of their rights. So for Lincoln, that meant that he needed to shore up the belief in the humanity of Black people. He had to do that before he moved on to civil or political rights. In doing so, for those considered the least and the most vulnerable in their community because they are the most outnumbered, white Americans would accustom themselves to protecting the rights of any who find themselves outnumbered in the political process and hence vulnerable to whatever majority happened to be in power. As Thomas Jefferson explained in his first inaugural address, though the will of the majority is, in all cases, to prevail, that will to be rightful must be reasonable, that the minority possess their equal rights, which equal laws must protect, and to violate would be oppression. Minority rights are precisely those rights possessed equally by the majority, the rights of the individual. By standing up for the individual natural rights of Black Americans, Lincoln was teaching white Americans how to defend their own rights. That was the foundation upon which he thought he could build any progress towards promoting civil or political rights for Black Americans. Now, I mentioned that by 1859, Lincoln considered Douglas the most dangerous enemy of liberty because he was the most insidious one. This insidious aspect of Douglas's rhetoric owed to his repeated claim of indifference or not caring about the spread of Black slavery. Lincoln's hatred towards Douglas's indifference, right? He's not speaking in favor of slavery. He's just indifferent about it. So Lincoln's hatred towards this attitude was not simply because slavery was clearly wrong. Lincoln hated it. And he hated this indifference towards slavery because in order for it to expand in this country, no one would actually have to make a positive argument to promote its advancement. Simply convince the majority of Americans who lived in free states, Northern whites, teach them not to care what happens to Black people in the federal territories. If you did that, slavery would expand eventually as far as local majority self-interest could carry it. Popular sovereignty, so called, would then represent not a natural right to choose one's rulers, but a mere legal right whose security depended solely on the majority will of the people. Crude majoritarianism, might dictating what is right. Lincoln therefore argued that the most urgent need was not to refute Southern slave owners, but to thwart Douglas's efforts to get Northern non-slave owners to acquiesce in the expansion of Black slavery into the territories. Lincoln argued that Douglas's perversion of popular sovereignty, this is what had to be the chief target for the new Republican Party in the mid to late 1850s. Only by doing so did he believe you could avoid, quote, a congressional slave code for the territories, the revival of the African trade, meaning the African slave trade, and what he called a second Dred Scott decision. He went on to remark that Douglas's positions, quote, leads to the nationalization of slavery as surely as does that of Jeff Davis, Mason of Virginia. The two positions are but slightly different roads to the same place, with this difference, that the nationalization of slavery can be reached by Douglas's route and never can by the other. Lincoln showed that if popular sovereignty became accepted in the North, it wouldn't be long before politicians argued for the repeal on the ban against slave importation. There being no principal difference between white Americans buying slaves domestically and buying them from abroad. And Lincoln put the matter crudely to show them how horrific this would be. He said, wherever they can buy them cheapest. A month after Lincoln's election in November 1860, Stephen Douglas proposed 2 amendments to the Constitution. This was on Christmas Eve, in fact, December 24th. South Carolina had at least publicly said that they had seceded. They were no longer a part of the United States, and Douglas is trying to do what he can to preserve the Union. So what does he do? He hoped to keep the seceding states from seceding by proposing 2 amendments, which would have been the 13th and 14th Amendment. His 14th Amendment would have made white supremacy the official policy of the United States, systemic, if you will. It banned Black Americans from voting or holding political office at any level and in any region of the country, city, state, federal territory, you name it. Blacks are not allowed to vote anywhere, and they can't hold political office anywhere. That was Douglas's 14th Amendment. Contrast that with the 14th Amendment we eventually ended up with. It's within this context, a bigoted state and a bigoted influential senator, that Lincoln tried to keep the nation directed towards a slave-free future. If he did not propose making Black Illinoisans equal citizens, giving them the vote, or repealing state laws, in fact, against racial intermarriage, it was because he thought that a more urgent and important priority existed, and that was to persuade white Americans in the North not to be tempted by Douglas's invitation to become indifferent to the spread of Black slavery into federal territories. Remarkably, in a state where Blacks possess few civil rights and no political rights, Lincoln consistently stood up for their possession of natural rights. Where Douglas was emphatic in reading Blacks out of the Declaration of Independence, Lincoln believed it included, the Declaration in principle included Black people, all people, everywhere. So I believe by looking back to Lincoln, who looked back to the American founders, many of whom were slaveholders, we can learn about the means and ends of American self-government as a way to gain clarity in our own troubled times. To meet the crisis of his day, Lincoln thought that a return to the language and principles of the founding generation would best recover or restore America to its original promise and aspirations. Comparing Lincoln's words with Stephen Douglas's show that one of them tried to refine and enlarge the public views, as Madison put it in Federalist 10, while the other simply reinforced and entrenched further white supremacy, both at the state and national level. The principles of the Declaration were central to this effort by Lincoln. As in Lincoln's day, Americans today, I argue, need, as he put it, to readopt the Declaration of Independence. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. And we have a lot of questions here that people have entered in. I'd like to get to some of those. As Lincoln as a leader, and he's putting forth his ideas and things, who was his role model that helped him formulate his ideas for these kind of things, and how was that built up in his life?
Yeah, historians and biographers are fond of quoting, and rightly quoting, Lincoln saying that Henry Clay was, quote, his beau ideal of a statesman, end quote. And so we in hearing that, we are reminded that Lincoln, of course, was not born in Illinois, but born in Kentucky. And that's the state from which Henry Clay hailed, and famously became one of the big three senators, the triumvirate, as they're referred to, in that antebellum period leading up to the early 1850s. Clay dies in 1852. So if you looked at any particular person and the way that person practiced politics, not simply what they thought, but how they tried to get things accomplished. And Clay, if was known for anything, he was known as the great compromiser, But in a way, that was a compliment to Clay. It wasn't just that he was splitting the difference. He was actually trying to compromise in a way that kept the country in the direction of freedom, if you will, a country worthy of the saving, as Lincoln put it. So Clay was a Whig, and therefore Lincoln was a Whig. He agreed more with the Whigs than the Jacksonian Democrats. And when the Whigs went the way of the dodo bird in after the 1852 presidential election, Lincoln, actually between 1854 and 56 in particular, Lincoln is a man without a party. In 1854, the Republican Party is birthed in a few states, runs their first president, nominee for president, John C. Fremont in 56. But between 54 and 56, Lincoln thinks he's still a Whig. He says, some people call me an abolitionist. I'm not that, but he does not call himself a Republican. And he only becomes a Republican when it's clear, partly with his influence, that it is going to be a coalition of a bunch of different groups, political groups, that's dedicated to the prevention of the expansion of racial slavery into the territories. That's what brings Lincoln into the Republican camp with 2 feet. And so those principles, mostly imbibed from the Whig or taken over from the Whig Party, I think if any man has a claim to Lincoln's political practice, it would be Clay. But in my book, Lincoln and the American Founding, my first chapter is on George Washington and what Lincoln learned from Washington as someone who obviously established the institutions of civil and political liberty in this country as a grand unifier, right? Washington was the man in his will who identified himself as the owner of Mount Vernon, and then as a citizen of the United States. He does not identify himself as a citizen of the Commonwealth of Virginia, interestingly enough. For Washington, there is no Commonwealth, there is no liberty, there is no independence without union. And so that unionizing principle and those policies that Washington, of course, fought for and then presided over as at the Constitutional Convention and as president 2 terms and willingly stepping down after 2 terms. These were things that make Washington ultimately, in practice, I think the grandest model for Lincoln. But in the 1850s, Lincoln needed a more recent public example to emulate. And it was an example that Stephen Douglas was trying to garner for himself. Stephen Douglas saw himself as donning the mantle of Clay, as a man who strode across the Mason-Dixon line. And he thought the principle of popular sovereignty could sell Americans both in free states and slave states. And so Lincoln was wrestling for that mantle with Stephen Douglas in the 1850s.
We have a teacher, Kelly, is asking, as my students and I work through Reconstruction, we examine Andrew Johnson's plan for Reconstruction. Can you explain why Lincoln chose Johnson as a running mate? And how do you think Lincoln would evaluate Johnson's approach to Reconstruction?
The easiest part is that second part. But you don't need a PhD to come up with that answer. Johnson's an interesting fellow for a number of reasons. To his credit, Johnson is the only senator from a seceding state who stays in the US Senate. He was a senator from Tennessee. All the other senators took off. In January and February of 1861, they famously made these farewell addresses in the Senate. Jeff Davis from Mississippi, Yulee, Yancey, all these senators from seceding states give these farewell addresses explaining why they're not going to show up for work the next day. Johnson does not. Johnson stays loyal to Tennessee, which he thinks needs to stay loyal to the Union. Of course, he's the only one of the few people in Tennessee that believes that. He was also military governor during the Civil War. And so Johnson's own political example of someone who didn't say my way or the highway, not my president, resistance. Johnson, as a Democrat, stayed loyal to the Union in the same way Democrats in the so-called border states stayed loyal. And Lincoln thought that was an important teaching, for an important lesson for the country. And then, of course, his faithfulness as a military governor. And so the way Johnson was chosen in 1864, remember, the Republican Party that year didn't even run as Republicans, quote unquote. They ran as the National Union Party. They wanted to make it very clear, like a point of purchase ad, that more important than labels were what did the party stand for? Okay. The Democrats stood for, calling for an immediate armistice. They could care less about the Emancipation Proclamation by the time 1864 rolled around. That was a reality. They wanted the war to be over. And if McClellan, who was nominated for the Democrats, he didn't agree with their platform, but if McClellan had become president, as Lincoln thought as late as August he was going to be elected, and Lincoln booted out, on day one, what would he do? His executive order would be revoking the Emancipation Proclamation. So Johnson was brought onto the ticket, even though Hamlin, I've not read much by Hamlin, but his speeches, especially in 1860, when he joins Lincoln on the ticket, are really impressive. The principled rhetoric there is quite inspiring, I think. Well, Hamlin just gets booted off the ticket because we need to show the country that, in a way, we're not a sectional party the way we were thought of in 1860, because that's the only place they got primarily their votes. They got some votes in Virginia and I hear in northern Alabama, but nowhere else in the seceding South. So Johnson was brought on to show that what was important is bringing the country together, preserving the Union, and you can't argue with his political or military practice up until that time. Unfortunately, he was as racist as Stephen Douglas was, and we found that out when he became president and made very explicit in his State of the Union addresses how little he thought about Black people by nature. So yeah, that was unfortunate. Frederick Douglass had this great comment. Andrew Johnson once gave a speech in front of a predominantly Black audience, and there were people in the audience saying, "Be our Moses, be our Moses." And Johnson allegedly said, "Oh, I will, if you want, I will be your Moses." We found out what that looked like, and Frederick Douglass said, "Yeah, he came in as Moses and went out as Pharaoh." I don't think Lincoln would disagree with that judgment of Frederick Douglass.
That kind of ties into this question. Would you say Johnson's white supremacy was equivalent to that of Stephen Douglas?
Oh, yeah. Oh, emphatically so. Yeah, he was explicit about that. He did not believe that any efforts should be made, contrary to Lincoln, who by 64 wanted Black people to vote. But of course, a president doesn't have a role to play in that. But Johnson made it explicit. He didn't want the South ruled by Black people. He didn't want Blacks to have rights in the South. This was something that was going to happen maybe in the sweet by and by, pie in the sky. In other words, never, as far as he understood it. He was both a principled and practical white supremacist. Yes.
At one point in your presentation, you said some people thought that Blacks were not meant to be citizens. And there's a question that kind of touches on that. Is it true that Lincoln invited significant numbers of African-American citizens to the White House and maybe suggested that they couldn't live together with whites and that they should be repatriated back to it?
Okay, great. So there's 2 points there. Let me make clear. When I said that they weren't intended to be made citizens in this country, I believe the context of that was Chief Justice Roger B. Taney's opinion in 1857 in the Dred Scott case, where he said 2 things, right? Blacks were never intended to be citizens of this country and therefore are not citizens and therefore couldn't sue in court. The case should have been remanded back to the circuit court at that point and said, you shouldn't have heard this case at all. But Taney went on to rule, oh, and by the way, Congress doesn't have authority to ban slavery in the territories. Okay, there's your twofer. So that was Taney. Taney said they couldn't be citizens. Now, during the war and in the summer before Lincoln issues his preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, he does that in September, and then of 1862, and then of course January 1 is the final Emancipation Proclamation. Prior to that, Lincoln makes a point of inviting local Black leaders, I think they were all ministers, to the White House, and he makes sure that there is a reporter present. Frederick Douglass is not invited to that meeting, but here's about it. And at that meeting, that's when Lincoln says to these Black Americans that they should get behind the policy, the idea of what was known as colonization. Not West Africa, not Liberia. Lincoln knew as early as 1854, that's a disaster, okay? He thought realistically, you have to find a place where Blacks would be able to work and it would be principal manual labor at the outset, given the condition of most Black people in the United States in the 1860s. He said it's more likely that this is going to be feasible or viable in Central America. And so he tries to get them to gin up support for expatriation to Central America. Lincoln thought that the racism of even Northern whites in the near term was going to prevent peaceful coexistence between the races. And he says, almost word for word, he says that think of in the place in this country where you are the most free, you are still treated as a second-class citizen. So it's because of that racism that Lincoln does not believe is going to go away in the, not even just the foreseeable future, but for decades. Lincoln thought better to try to create a self-governing society among yourselves somewhere else. So he does make that proposal explicit. He wants white Americans to hear that in hopes that it'll grease the skids for the Emancipation Proclamation later that year. Because remember, the problem with emancipation in America was always a two-part question. It was first you emancipate, and then this question, what then? What happens to Blacks who have become American after all? For generations, they've been in the country. What happens to them after emancipation? And that's the thing that got whites, especially in the North, nervous. They weren't sure if people who had been enslaved for so long would be equipped to live as free people. And there's a number of other reasons why they were nervous about that. So Lincoln was essentially saying, look, hey, we can emancipate, but hey, if I can get support for Black colonization, which by the way, Clay was also very much in favor of, maybe it will make whites more receptive to emancipation, which was, after all, very controversial when Lincoln issued it. In 1863, that didn't gain votes. Republicans lost seats in the State House in 1863 as a result of the Emancipation Proclamation. I'll mention one other example. One of the two dissenters in the Dred Scott case, 7-2 case, one of the two dissenters, Benjamin Curtis from Massachusetts. So no stretch of an apologist for slavery. He publishes a pamphlet about 70, 80 pages long called Executive Power, where he excoriates, he condemns Lincoln for the Emancipation Proclamation, among other things, what he called abuses of presidential authority. And so if you've even got a fairly influential Massachusetts politician, Corton, at this point, a judge, well, he retired after the Dred Scott case. If even Benjamin Curtis thought emancipation wasn't manifestly constitutional, it's something we have to remind ourselves about, that when Lincoln did it, he really was sticking his neck out.
So was Lincoln like this throughout his entire life, that he fought for these rights, or did he have an opportunity to ever represent Black people in the court systems, or as an attorney?
It goes both ways, and this is an area that I haven't done a lot of research in, but he has been both in favor of the rights of Blacks and in favor of the rights of whites when a Black was a litigant. So he was a typical lawyer, and I don't mean that in a pejorative way. Everybody in this country deserves their rights to be protected and have their day in court. So I mean that in the highest sense. Lincoln represented both sides. I think the most important thing to keep in mind, or an important thing to keep in mind about Lincoln, is while he was not in favor of putting on the front burner, expanding the civil and political rights of Blacks in Illinois, when he becomes president, and certainly after the Emancipation Proclamation, he's no longer in favor of Black colonization. And then to his generals, Nathaniel Banks in particular in Louisiana in 1864, and then to the new moderate governor of Louisiana, Michael Hahn, privately, he says to them, look, as president, I have no authority, but do what you can in your new state convention to give Blacks an education. In other words, pay for those schools. And as he puts it, for the very intelligent and those who have served in the military for the Union, give them the vote. And this he makes public on April 11th, his so-called last public address. It wasn't actually his last public address, but one of them. And this is the one that Booth is present for. And Booth says, that means, I'll be polite, Negro citizenship. I'm going to run him through. So the idea of kidnapping Lincoln and members of his cabinet became an assassination plot. Seward, Lincoln, among others. And it's because Lincoln stood up for voting rights for Black people in April of '65.
Now, we just have time for this one last question for you. You talked a little bit about Frederick Douglass. What was his opinion of Abraham Lincoln?
Woo! You got to invite me back to give a speech about that. How to make this short. Frederick Douglass knew of Lincoln, didn't know Lincoln, but knew of Lincoln starting as early as the Lincoln-Douglas debates in 1858 in Illinois. He followed the debate between Douglass and Lincoln. He was following the Republican Party because it was becoming the only adversary of the Democratic Party, which by that time, north and south of the Mason-Dixon line, could care less about Black people. So the future of abolition rested with not the Liberty Party or any other party, it rested with the Republican Party. So he paid very close attention to the debates. During the Civil War, Douglass wanted it to be an abolition war. Lincoln came to that a little later for his own reasons. Douglass excoriated Lincoln in his own newspaper when he hears about that colonization meeting he has with Black leaders. And so he was a very fierce critic of Lincoln's, but he meets with Lincoln twice during the presidency, in 1863, summer of 1863, and in 1864. And he is impressed on both occasions with Lincoln's character, his mind, and his commitment to doing what he can for Black people in light of the context of preserving the Union. He gives one of his most famous speeches on the dedication of the Freedmen's Memorial, that statue of the crouching, rising slave and Lincoln standing over him, which has been the subject of controversy. Boston removed their replica, and it's still up in DC. In that speech, Douglass gives one of his most famous speeches, and he says in that speech that Lincoln is emphatically preeminently the white man's president. But he goes on to say, but for Lincoln, considering the opinion of white people, he would neither have emancipated slaves nor preserved the Union. And Douglass acknowledges, he admits in that speech that he was wrong about Lincoln turning it into an abolition war first. And in so doing, you would save the Union. He said, no, but for saving the Union, we could not have gotten emancipation. So as he puts it, viewed from the genuine abolition ground, which is Douglass's ground, this is Douglass in 1876. He says, Lincoln seemed cold, dull, tardy, and indifferent. But viewed from the ground of a statesman, which he is bound to consult the opinion of the voting public, most of whom are white, Douglass says Lincoln was swift, zealous, radical, and determined.
Super. Well, I thank you. That's all the time we do have for questions right now. So I'd like to thank you for joining us tonight for an excellent presentation. How can people follow you through social media? We're going to send out an email to everybody and give them a link to where they can get your book and things like that. How can they follow you on social media?
Well, I'm on Twitter, and my handle is Lincoln Douglass, one word, and it better be Douglas with 2 S's, not the other Douglas. So it's Lincoln Douglass, one word on Twitter.
Okay, super. Thank you again. I'd also like to thank the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library and Museum, the Herbert Hoover National Historic Site, and all of the public libraries who helped make tonight's program a success. I encourage you all to come and visit the Hoover campus and enjoy a walk around the park and explore the historic buildings as the temperatures begin to come back up a little bit. For now, the Presidential Library remains closed to the public, but their staff is working behind the scenes for a gradual reopening, and the National Historic Site grounds and historic buildings are now open to the public. However, the Visitor Center still remains closed for the time being, as well as the Friends Meeting House and the Prairie Trails, as they're under construction as crews work on a flood mitigation project along the creek. So the Birthplace Cottage, the blacksmith shop, the schoolhouse, gravesite are all open daily till 5 p.m. The Hoover Presidential Foundation staff is still hard at work and ready to assist you with your membership needs or charitable gifts in support of the Hoover campus. Just call or email us with any needs that you may have. And don't forget to register for a special program that we have next week, next Thursday at 6 p.m. It's on the 25th at 6 p.m. It's called Behind the Scenes, Firing Line with Margaret Hoover. Margaret will tell us how she brought back the iconic series to PBS and how she lands America's most interesting guests. Registration is free and it's now open on our website. So on behalf of all of us at the Hoover campus and the participating public libraries, we thank you for joining us and we look forward to your next visit to the Hoover campus.